Today, I will be discussing psychedelic drugs and their potential to treat mental illnesses. To start, let me introduce you to the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS for short. Rick Doblin, the founder, was one of few psychiatrists during the 1970s and 1980s that was researching the therapeutic effects of MDMA, or as they called it at the time, ATOM. MAPS was founded in 1986, 1 year after the DEA declared many known street drugs as Schedule I because they had no known medical uses. In turn, Rick Doblin actually sued the DEA on unjust grounds and won, but the DEA ignored the judge's ruling and MDMA remained highly illegal. Given MAPS is a non-profit, it creates much difficulty for them to raise money in order to research these illegal drugs. If it weren't for the DEA intervening, it could have very well likely that we would see these drugs on the market today. However, the legality of all this is for its own discussion. Whereas this discussion, we will primarily focus on three of MAPS's research drugs: MDMA, ayahuasca, and LSD. Whether you're a fan of Tony Robbins or not, we must acknowledge that he does have some very good concepts, such as his 2mm rule. He often applies it to golf, considering a small change of degree can land you 30 to 40 yards from your target, but I like to compare it to walking. Imagine you are walking side by side with your mentally troubled self. Your self has been following the same path of therapy for years. The sessions are great and enlightening, but each time you walk out the door, you jump right back into the same routine that ended you in therapy in the first place. Okay, so now you're looking at your other self and wondering, how can you finally reach that destination you've been trying so hard to reach? You've been following the rules as they've been given to you, and it doesn't seem to work, and you know just walking backwards will only take more time and more trouble. So now it's time for yourself to take a 2mm step to the left, just a 2-degree change. It may not seem like anything at the time, but after an hour walking, you find yourself to be a mile from where you were before, yet continuing to head in the right direction. Then imagine where you would be a day, a week, or even a month after that small change. You could very well be in a different state, both of boundary and of mind. Psychedelics may just be the best option we have in order to initiate this 2mm change in direction. First up for discussion is the use of 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. Last year, MAPS completed their Phase 2 trials for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. There were 107 participants with an average of 18 years battling PTSD. They had all been unsuccessful in their past treatments, and after 12 weeks of the MDMA treatment, 61% no longer met diagnostic criteria for PTSD, and after 1 year, nearly 70% no longer met criteria. Next, MAPS moves on to their Phase 3 trials. This is when the FDA steps in and assesses the safety and efficacy of the protocol. If all goes well, Rick Doblin is hoping to see MDMA hit the market come 2022. When talking about PTSD, there are three main brain regions associated with it: the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. Here we have the amygdala, and it is overactive in PTSD. It is responsible for triggering our fight or flight response. The amygdala also stores short-term memory as well as emotionally significant, which sort of go hand in hand. You see, we tend to remember things more thoroughly when we're able to attach some emotional significance to it. If we can, then it holds up strong in our memory. However, for traumatic memories, there's so much emotion attached to them that it's almost like they're permanently placed in the front of our amygdala, ready to be remembered at all times. Because these memories sit on the tip of our tongue, our fight or flight is constantly being triggered because we keep thinking of that traumatic memory. Now, normally, when our fight or flight is sent off, it immediately encounters our prefrontal cortex, which will ration with the amygdala and determine whether we really do have to fight or flight. This area is responsible for a lot of our conscious functioning. It includes our logic and ego and personality. This is all decreased in those with PTSD. So when the fight or flight is triggered, our prefrontal cortex is too weak to stop it, and it most often will send us into a panic attack. The image on the left illustrates how the amygdala acts during PTSD. You see the prefrontal cortex says to the amygdala, "We talked about this, no stress signals unless there's a real problem." And the amygdala all cute saying there, no. Now the hippocampus, it isn't as important than the others, but it does play a significant role in memory consolidation, specifically long-term memories. Now with PTSD, the communication between the hippocampus and the amygdala is decreased, and the amygdala isn't able to transfer memories over to long-term memory storage. This ends up prolonging the stress on the amygdala due to how much emotional significance it is holding. Now when someone with PTSD takes MDMA, some really cool things happen in the brain. At this point, it is important to note that MDMA and ecstasy are not the same thing. Ecstasy is a street drug that contains small traces of pure MDMA, while it is laced with many other drugs such as bath salts and cocaine. Regardless now, when you take MDMA, it begins to increase production of oxytocin and prolactin, both of which assist in forming new bonds of trust. This is helpful when building a relationship with the clinician. Next, it will decrease the activity in the amygdala and increase activity in the prefrontal cortex. Now, with less fight or flights being triggered, the prefrontal cortex is strong enough to ration with the amygdala and talk themselves out of it. MDMA also increases communication between the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, when in therapy on MDMA, a client can recall their traumatic memories without spiraling into a panic attack. The increased prefrontal cortex activity can assist them in logically picking apart the memories and potentially removing unnecessary emotions. And now that the communication link is strong again, the amygdala can begin to pass these memories onto the hippocampus's long-term memory bank. Now, keep in mind, these MDMA sessions take 8 hours, and there's 3 of them. That's 24 hours of MDMA therapy within 3 months. That's a lot to handle. But frankly, nothing compared to the 18 years of PTSD that those have battled. Hopefully, MAPS' Phase 3 trials go as planned, and we can see MDMA come to market by 2022. Now it's time to move on from MDMA and on to ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a South American, indigenous liquid brew that is known to be the most potent psychedelic on the planet. Like I said, ayahuasca is a liquid brew made from the vines of Banisteriopsis caapi and the leaves from a shrub known as Psychotria viridis. It's interesting to note here how Psychotria viridis resembles Psycho Veritas, which would mean psychological truth. The Banisteriopsis caapi contains beta-carboline alkaloids, which act as powerful monoamine oxidase inhibitors, whereas Psychotria viridis contains N,N-dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a monoamine. DMT is also in fact found all throughout nature and the animal kingdom, including in the cerebral spinal fluid of humans. DMT itself can be smoked or snorted and has been known to cause an extremely powerful yet very short trip, whereas ayahuasca lasts for several hours because it's digested thanks to the MAOIs. Now normally the Psychotria viridis, which contains DMT, it cannot be broken down because the gut will break down the MAOIs. But now that you have something that can inhibit that, you're able to eat it and it will break down. It won't break down in your stomach and will enter your bloodstream and you will have that hallucinogenic trip. Whereas DMT is extracted directly and you smoke it. It's important to acknowledge that N,N-dimethyltryptamine and 5-hydroxytryptamine, aka serotonin, are both tryptamines, and therefore share similar chemical makeups, as you can see on the image on the screen. DMT has a natural attraction to all of the serotonin receptors in the brain, and acts as an agonist at 3 specific 5-HT subreceptors, 1C, 2A, and 2C. When looking at addiction in the brain, we must look at the mesolimbic pathway, otherwise known as the brain's reward center. It is in this reward center that reinforcement and withdrawal are born. You see, when under the influence of a drug, our dopamine levels likely spike, making us feel great, but also tricking our brain. This has been coined as diabolical learning, because normally when we do something healthy, such as exercising, our brain releases dopamine and says to us, yes, this is good, keep doing this. But when under the influence of an abusive substance, our brain will still receive the dopamine, we will still feel good, and our brains will continue to tell us, yes, this is good, keep doing this. And even when it's alcohol, it's destroying your body, it's going to keep telling you that because it wants your reinforcement of the dopamine. And now when our dopamine is low, we begin to feel withdrawal symptoms such as craving. Our brains miss that dopamine so much, and it will inevitably beg us to give it more. Therefore, we relapse on whatever drug gave us the dopamine to begin with. Now back to ayahuasca again, or DMT. It's important to note it has a natural attraction to the serotonin receptors. The MAOIs in the Banisteresis copy increase serotonin and dopamine levels at the 5-HT1C receptor. But DMT has agnostic effects on receptors 2A and 2C, which decrease levels. The increasing and decreasing of levels helps to balance them out to a point below reinforcement levels and above the levels needed for withdrawal. Now, the dual deficit model was introduced by Michael Bauman and Richard Rothman, both experts with the National Institute for Drug Abuse. They say that prolonged drug use results in constant decreased levels of dopamine and serotonin, thus contributing to a high chance for relapse, as well as the decreased ability to feel everyday pleasures, known as anhedonia. Also, low levels of serotonin lead to depression, obsessive thoughts, and impulsive behaviors, and suicide ideations, all of which are known symptoms of withdrawal. Craving acts as a behavioral motivation for the brain's homeostatic desire to balance the dopamine levels while going through withdrawal. It is hypothesized that ayahuasca's anti-addictive properties stem from its ability to increase serotonin and balance out the amount of dopamine in the brain. Moving on to the synaptic plasticity, this has to do with the diabolical learning I was speaking of. It is a process in which the connections between neurons are altered. This alteration of neurons is believed to be a leading factor in the development and maintenance of addiction. These new neurons are what were built from the diabolical learning. They were so creatively built that when an alcoholic, per se, drives past a liquor store, they will receive a dopamine boost. This acts in a way to motivate an individual to give the brain its desired dopamine boost, in this case the liquor for the alcoholic. Not only do abusive substances diminish our physical health, but they basically hijack the brain into thinking that this behavior is something that is necessary for the sustainment of our life. It's hypothesized that ayahuasca allows for the balance of dopamine and serotonin and other biochemical levels while facilitating an adaptive synaptic plasticity. Through this, ayahuasca may allow an individual to learn new behaviors without hijacking the brain. With all the visual and emotional cascades of ayahuasca, an individual is able to unlearn their addictive behaviors while not having to worry about the reinforcement of dopamine increase. This is just the physiological effects of ayahuasca. There are still many psychological effects of this substance, such as transcendental experiences. Now, transcendental experiences, well, the N,N-dimethyltryptamine in ayahuasca allows an individual to access their emotional unconscious, thus forging a path to heal past trauma. But not only does it create a pathway to past traumas, it may also forge a pathway to experience the consequences of future action, such as the ongoing substance abuse. These transcendental experiences are what aid in the treatment of substance abuse, and they can originate out of a psychedelic trip or out of life itself. Out of life itself, overdosing would be an example of a transcendental experience for some abusers, and a car accident could be an example for a normal person to decide to turn their life around. These transcendental experiences can also be experienced through the hallucinogenic trip of lysergic acid dithylamide, aka LSD, which has also been studied for its effects on substance abuse and has yielded similar results to ayahuasca. For the sake of a thorough discussion, however, I will be detailing the effects of LSD on individuals with depression and/or anxiety, unlike addiction that ayahuasca treated. To begin, I'd like to reference a concept from Michael Pollan's recent book, How to Change Your Mind. He asks his readers to close their eyes and imagine a hill covered in snow, and so I ask you to do the same. Now pretend each one of your thoughts rides a sled down the hill. As each sled goes down, it creates a path in the snow. As more and more thoughts ride down the hill, you'll start to notice designated paths for certain thoughts, and certain sleds, therefore. So now, as you begin to think a thought, you will inevitably think it in a certain perspective, and it will lead you to a similar solution as many thoughts before. And this can be devastating for someone with depression or anxiety. People then get stuck in a continuous loop of negative thoughts, and it's impossible to escape because there are no other ways to think at that point. But then, Michael Pollan asks his readers to imagine a blizzard comes through. Although blizzards themselves are scary and blinding, and we'll go back to this, they also create a fresh layer of snow. Now with a fresh layer of snow, a sled can ride down the hill and create a brand new trail of thought. The old paths are no more, and the brain now has a blank slate to think. This is what LSD can do. Okay, so let's talk about that blizzard. The blizzard is known as ego dissolution, or as Carl Jung preferred, ego death, and it is the beginning stages of an LSD trip. We all have aspects of ourselves that belong on the other side of society, and so we suppress them, because the good side of society won't have any of it. This suffering is only a product of our ego. Our ego is what cares what others think. It's our ego that creates the filters in which we view the world. LSD acts to strip us of our ego, and it is the most mind-bending experience known to man. When administered, LSD lasts about 10 to 12 hours. The ego dissolution stage, however, about 1 hour. I use a blizzard to describe the process because you never truly know what you're about to enter when you walk into a snowstorm. When in the middle of that hour, we can feel our self-identity begin to diminish, as if it's snowing so hard you can't see your own hands. This blizzard also resembles quicksand, because if you panic, you'll only get sucked deeper into the storm. It's important to note here that this panic may easily be the most dangerous aspect of LSD. Besides the panic, there are 0 physical side effects of LSD, obviously besides any that you may inflict on yourself, which is very unlikely because doesn't create aggressiveness. But the key to the blizzard is to relax. Allow this new feeling to take over, because once it does, it will guide you out of the storm and into the raw world. This raw world now allows for adaptive synaptic plasticity. Now, there's nothing quite like waking up in the morning and seeing all the trees freshly covered and towering over this perfect blanket of snow. Once our ego is dissolved, this is what we see: a blank slate, a perfectly white blanket of snow. We no longer hold perspective or see through filters. We no longer see ourselves and the world, we only see the world and the beauty it provides for us. As I mentioned with ayahuasca, this synaptic plasticity allows for brand new neural connections, one that were never even fathomable before. However, this is only possible due to the decreased communication within the default mode network, or the DMN. The default mode network is most often used when an individual is not focused on the outside environment. It is also active when we're at rest, or when social and talking with other people. Our default mode network is what allows us to cognitively function while interacting with the outside world. It's what allows us to project our ego, among others. Those with depression tend to have a decreased activity in the default mode network, which in turn has us lose our sense of self a bit, resulting in that empty feeling known to be a symptom of depression. So naturally, we view the world through a duality lens. There's good and there's bad. There's hot and there's cold. There's love and there's hate. And in the case of ego death, there's accepting and there's rejecting. In society, there tends to be one side that people want to be on, like the good side. and then there's the other side. We all have aspects of ourselves that belong on the other side, and so we suppress them because the good side of society won't have any of it. This suffering of suppression is only a product of our ego. Now, on to lysergic acid diethylamide again. From a study in Switzerland in accordance with MAPS, researchers acknowledged that despite its visual effects, LSD influences a vast number of neurotransmitters. Just as ayahuasca influences the 5-HT2A and 2C receptors, so does LSD, which also influences the 5-HT1A receptor. It has been proven that LSD immensely increases the neuronal activity within the brain. However, it has not been proven to improve the lives of those with depression or anxiety. This is because LSD was made illegal before major depressive disorder was inducted into the DSM. This was around the 1960s, I believe. Most of the data on LSD is subjective and based on individual experiences, many of which report an improvement in mood and life itself, such as the changes in perception of time and space. In a study at the Imperial College in London, researchers studied the effects of LSD on the brain and witnessed the effects through the use of an MRI. The MRIs were done when participants' eyes were closed, indicating that even when seeing nothing, the LSD brain is constantly trying to communicate across all lengths of the brain. And you can see it in the MRI scans on this slide. The little pink in the back left, the back end is the visual cortex. You can see in all the LSD brains that is entirely lit up in addition to the rest of the brain, whereas placebos, it's normally only the visual cortex that will light up because there's nothing else going on. Now, as for some final remarks, in contrast to how I once believed and quoted on my own, depression is an inadequate perception of the world as we experience and manifest it. I have questioned that concept due to an idea that you, Dale Michaels, presented in class. You have said that those suffering depression actually see the world for what it truly is, whereas those who live happy lives see a distorted version of the world, one that aligns with the way in which they wish to live. Regardless of whether this is the case, LSD allows you to metaphorically enter the world as if you had just been born, yet with all the experiences you have ever since gathered. In fact, this is the case for all psychedelics, some more potent than others. And, if we research them properly, we may be able to begin a new era in the practice of mental illness treatment. Thank you.